Welcome to the world of wonders at Paranormal M, where every mystery holds a key to the unknown. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and if you feel like it, drop a comment, help me out, and get ready to embark on a journey through the unexplained with us. Get ready to challenge your perceptions. Unexplained Paranormal Experience 2 years ago. I had a profound paranormal experience when I was up in Culver, Indiana 2 years ago. It had been bothering me ever since. I was in Culver, Indiana, staying at the Vonnegut house with my family for my twin brother's graduation. The house is very old because it was built in 1889. I was sitting on the deck of the porch swing that was nearest to the door on the phone, listening to some music and enjoying myself. It was the middle of the day at around 12 o'clock. It was bright and it was beautiful outside. All of a sudden, I heard what sounded to be like small rocks hitting the deck of the sunroom that were being thrown in my general direction. When I looked to see who threw them, I was thinking it was my cousin trying to be annoying. But what I saw was this almost person-shaped black mass/apparition that moved to the right and then darted off, and I could clearly hear footsteps when that thing moved. Keep in mind that it manifested itself in broad daylight. I went to look at what was thrown at me, and it was 3 pieces of gravel that were around the area below the sunroom. When I looked down over the sunroom rail and to the right, nothing was there. I was well above 7 feet off the ground due to the sunroom being elevated, and my cousin, who was only about 8 or 9, couldn't possibly be tall enough to be visible, through the railing. That thing's head was a little bit below the top of the railing, so it must have been over 7 feet tall. Needless to say, that experience scared me shitless, and I can say that I'm now no longer a skeptic. Does anybody have a clue as to what I witnessed on that day? I wonder if ghosts use lawnmowers. Apparitions thrice in one day. I'll just get right into it. Technically yesterday and very early this morning, I suppose, I saw some hard-to-explain things, accompanied by the eerie feeling that I've had before when I'm sure there's a spirit or other entity afoot. First-time poster, long-time believer. So, the first occurrence was around 3 p.m. I was sitting in a recliner listening to an audiobook in my headphones while my son did his schoolwork on a Chromebook across the small living room in another chair. I'm next to a window. He's like 10-ish feet away next to the bar, what divides the living room from the kitchen in the house. It's a pretty gray day, and the only light's on the bar light right above the boy. I watched the birds for a pretty good while. I'm doing this as I'm listening, and I slowly turn to lay my head back, maybe even shut my eyes for a moment. Then I see a shadow moving as if a person was getting up and putting the chair my son was in. The bar light backlights the chair area from my point of view, so it makes sense initially, except that the size and movement of the shadow looks very adult. In fact, I first thought it was my mom, but she was at an appointment. It moves strangely, too, kinda lumbering and slow. Imagine an old man pushing himself out of his favorite easy chair. That's a good image. Like that. Then walked away in an almost gliding fashion out of sight, going towards the kitchen and dining room. So my brain dismisses the thought it was my mom or other adult, and I turned to ask my son what he was doing. "Are you done yet? Needing a snack?" He was still sitting in the chair, same position, focusing on his laptop screen. I had a strange feeling and even craned my neck to look into the kitchen and dining room for someone. Then suddenly my dog, who's tethered on a lead out in the front yard, begins barking at the front door. I mean, he's not coming up to the porch just doing his stranger alert bark while looking at her door. I sit up totally spooked now, look on the porch. Maybe the cat, maybe a bird, but nothing's there. He carries on another 10 seconds or so, then walks away to the side yard where he has his house. I should add the direction the shadow figure moved could have been heading to the dining room behind us or the door, directly behind me. I only figured it was going to the kitchen because I thought it was my kid. So that was spooky, and I feel heavy in my chest, but I just shake it off and continue with my day. Later, around 1 a.m., my friend comes over after he got off work. My dog, an 11th-month-old, gets overly excited when we have guests. I didn't want him waking anybody up, so we sit in his car and we visit. He was just coming to drop something off, so we're going over to another day, and he's dominating the conversation, so I had not yet mentioned the weird shadow person. It's about 1:20 by now, and I'm looking out the window, which I rolled down to better listen for my puppy making trouble inside. He was sleeping like a good boy. I space out toward the house, looking in the living room window, the same one I was sitting next to before. That's when I see a bright gold single slow pulsation of light. We have tall windows, maybe 5 feet tall, and this light was long vertically and took up probably the top half of the window's height. It was very golden and appeared out of nowhere, grew very bright and long. Then, just as quickly dimmed into nothing again. We were sitting at the end of the driveway, and I would have noticed a car driving around the corner. Besides that, the light didn't move. In fact, it was unnaturally stationary. It strobed in and out without appearing to deviate from its original position. I should also add that where it was positioned would have been hovering right above the chair. Thought I saw the shadow standing there from earlier. So I began turning my head and moving my phone around to try recreating it. Although I had only turned my head before, I laughed, not knowing what else to do. I asked my friend if he saw that. Apparently he didn't. I described what I saw and then told him about what I saw earlier. He was a bit spooked and joked about being glad he wasn't staying over, and we laughed nervously. I turned back to the house and almost immediately see another apparition, this time in my bedroom window. It's the far end of the house. I just accidentally scrolled down way too far. That's not me calling a cat. It's me looking for where the hell I am. It does the same thing, strobes into existence and then back out, slightly faster than the gold light did. And this light was very bright. It was like the other, but it was bright blue and long horizontally. The other light had been pretty well centered in one of the panes above that chair, but this one looked like it was right at the edge of the window. So as the light strobes out horizontally, part of it was not visible. It was disappearing beyond the wall, while the other side stretched almost halfway across the window. Oddly, the sides of the window in question has another chair, which is my writing nook, right next to it. It is not next to the window, but just to the left of it, where the light seemed to have been focused. I tell my friend I saw another light. I describe it, and again try turning my head to recreate it with no luck. I could find no explanation or source for the lights. Poked around a bit in the yard and the living room and my room, just trying to explain it. I could not. My 2 ghost stories. So it's not much, but I'll give you the only 2 ghost encounters I've had in my life. The first was back in 2012 at this older house. My mom was visiting a friend, and the dude had some cousins around my age at the time down the street. Everything was normal at first. It was just me and these two other girls and a guy who was maybe 16 or 17 that lived next door to them and would come over. The four of us were just hanging out, and us girls were watching him play Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. He eventually leaves because it's almost 1 a.m. and me and the two girls head upstairs to the bedroom. The layout of the house was weird. Allow me to explain so you can get a better picture. The upstairs floor only consisted of a bedroom, the one mentioned, and a bathroom. However, there was a weird hallway that branched off to the left of the bathroom that just looped around to the other side of the bedroom. Me and the girls were sitting next to the bed in this shady-ass room full of toys and stuffed garbage bags. And we hear footsteps outside the door, which is the hallway next to the stairs. We, of course, all look over to the entrance on the other side of the room that has no door, the one I mentioned that was off to the left of the bathroom. Mind you, there is no one else in the house but me, the girls, and their obese father. I mentioned the fact that he's obese because he was so obese that he couldn't come up the stairs. The three of us book it down the stairway, but to this day I swear I saw something in that black hallway. The second experience was a few years ago, 2016, somewhere around there. The first story I mentioned, I think I saw something, but in this one I actually did. My friend lived in a very old house that was deteriorating and witchcraft had been practiced inside of it. His mother and grandmother lived there. His grandmother was the one doing the witchcraft, and this led me to multiple strange things happening in the house for years, including those of my friend's mom being picked up and shook by an unseen force. There were 3 entities in that house. One was believed to be a deceased family member, a demon, and a little girl. But they also speculated that the demon might just be taking the form of the little girl. Me, having that unexplainable event happen just years prior, was a believer in the paranormal, and I still am. Well, one night I was over at this house and it was about 11 p.m. I decided I wanted to head home because I was bored. I was standing at the stairway just casually glancing over the railing. Well, I glanced the last time before heading outside. There was a black silhouette of a little girl. Of course, people won't believe me when I say this, but I quite literally saw the little girl. It was the first time I'd actually seen something, and to this day I'm a strong believer in the supernatural. Daughter 3 says there's a lady. I want to preface this by saying I'm not dismissing this as a part of her imagination developing. She is 3, though, has never constructed a narrative before, and I'm not sure where this came from. Last night, she and her little brother were both scared to go into the loft and living room. It's an old house, over 100 years old. I'm fixing this up, and we moved into maybe like 3 or 4 months ago. She randomly said about 2 hours ago that there's a lady in the house. I laughed and asked her what the lady does. What followed an increasingly weird conversation where I asked simple, kind of non-leading questions. She gave me the following information. The lady lived in the house, wears a green dress, and picks up her toys. She saw her in the window picking up toys, and she lives upstairs in the loft and attic area. She can't tell us her name because the lady will get mad. The lady is her friend. The lady does not like Mom. I obviously instinctively thought there was a woman secretly living in her house because of all the stories. Took my German Shepherd up there. I've noticed before, by the way, that our cat refuses to go upstairs, so my dog was fine and checked the place out. We really searched every nook and cranny. There's no evidence of entry or anybody being up there. The German Shepherd didn't seem bothered by anything up there, and she definitely didn't smell anyone. If somebody was up there, they'd have a hard time getting her to like them. She's a semi-aggressive with those, outside of the pack. She's mauled an intruder at her house, so I don't think anybody's up there. I found the courage to turn around and look. Way back in 2002, I was living in a small studio flat apartment in Whalley Range, Manchester, UK. For those of you who are unfamiliar with a studio flat, it's a small apartment with a bedroom, living room, and kitchen. It's all these things all in one open room with a small bathroom. It's where you live when you're not quite poor enough to be homeless. That, sir, is actually a car. But at the time, I was working at a restaurant as a barman. Didn't get home until pretty late, around midnight. One evening, I came home from work and went to bed. Shortly after, I heard noises in the kitchen, 2 meters from my bed, which sounded like somebody walking around. My first thought was that somebody had broken into my flat whilst I was out, then hid when I came home and waited until I fell asleep before trying to sneak out. Jumped out of bed ready to wrestle a crackhead, but no one was there. Searched everywhere, which didn't take long considering how small my shitty apartment was. Went back to bed but left the lamp on. The same noises started again almost instantly. This time, however, I could clearly hear the sound of footsteps and leather shoes on the kitchen floor. Because I knew there was nobody in the apartment, I became almost paralyzed with fear. It's hard to describe because it's not fear in a conventional sense, but fear of something unknown. The footsteps got closer and closer until the floorboard in line with my pillow loudly creaked. Whatever it was standing right behind me, and that's when I heard it breathing. Its breath was loud and labored, as if it was struggling to breathe. At this point, I was as terrified as I've ever been in my life, but decided to turn around and have a look. I knew this may be my only chance to see something extraordinary so very slowly, so I peeked over my shoulder and saw it. It looked like a shadow, not a 2-dimensional shadow cast on an object, but a 3-dimensional one in the middle of the room. Some of it wasn't visible, and from the shoulders up and from the knees down it had faded away, but in the area in between I could clearly make out like a back with arms and hands. They were swinging gently at its sides. I could also see the upper legs moving. It was slowly walking away from me and continued to do so until it reached a window and faded away completely. I didn't sleep that night thinking about what I saw, and if I would ever come back. Rather it, and it didn't. Even now, some nights I lie awake wondering if I'd actually seen a ghost. A reason why dying people see a group of kids instead of family before dying. A bit of a spooky story here. My grandfather is on hospice from cancer in his lungs, and during his period of delirium, he started seeing 2 boys. He described them as small, but one not as little as the other, wearing jeans. Since he was in delirium, I didn't think much of it as it was probably hallucination and they were upsetting him since he said that they were going into his stuff. Didn't know who they belonged to, and one boy ate chili and began crying. I looked into the paranormal side of things, and I was under an impression visitors are just that, visiting. They don't tend to bother or to torment the one that they are visiting. These boys would bug him getting into his stuff and were not tormentors, but they were upsetting him. So I told the boys to please go back to where they came from since they were upsetting him. I asked him if they had names. He said the boys wouldn't answer him or really respond to him. They would hide around when I was around him, and again, I thought it was just hallucination. Another night passes, and suddenly, there's a little girl. Same thing. Doesn't know who she is or where she came from, or who she belongs to. It bothers him because it's some strange child visiting him that he doesn't recognize, and he wants to know who the parents are. The little girl, he would make faces at her, playful, trying to entertain her. but he never gave an age range of the little girl. I do know he and his late wife, who died 17 years prior, had 2 babies, male and female. They died shortly after birth back in the 50s. Part of him thought this little girl could be his late daughter visiting. Some nights pass, and suddenly there are children, about 4 boys and 3 girls. He recognizes none of them and wonders who let all these kids in. They continue to, for lack of a better term, hang around him until he slips out of consciousness. Then, when he regains consciousness, they're all still around looking at this dresser. He's upset because he doesn't know who these children belong to. I brush it off as his delirium, and a week passes. His condition is in the state of kind of starting his death rattle. And so his younger sister and niece come to visit him. It's emotional. They came in the late afternoon, and the hospice nurse was going to come by and check on the health. His sister and niece went to visit his younger brother, who's in a nursing home, not dying, but he had his legs removed. They visit him, and hours pass. They then return back to see him again before they head back to their homes. His niece tells his daughter something interesting. His brother had said this apparently during their visit. The brother was upset and irritated, thinking that my grandfather had died or he was going insane. He had told his sister and niece that he swore for the life of him he had heard on a previous day. No specific day was given to me, but the day of, day before, or 2 days prior to it sounded like. He heard his brother, my grandpa, calling out to him, which freaked him out. Even more so, my grandpa was with a group of children. They were all laughing and playing. This made him wonder if he was going insane because he didn't know any of these kids, didn't recognize the voices or understand why his brother would be in a group of children. He wondered if he had died. My aunt told him that no, he was still alive, which put my mind at rest. But when they left him, he was still upset, thinking he might be going insane. His daughter called me over, as I've been staying to help take care of him. Told me to tell him about the kids. I didn't know yet what my grandpa's brother said to them, so I told them about how he was seeing the kids, 2 at first, then more, and eventually that little group of children. They told me what his brother had said, and it sent a shiver up my spine. There is no way my aunt knew about the kids until I told her, and likewise, there's no way his brother would have known since he has strict visits due to COVID and nursing home rules. His niece believes that he's transitioning from this world into the next, and he was checking in on his younger brother. His sister, whom is also his younger sister, said that his grandpa had done this his entire life. He was always the protective good big brother, watching out for his little siblings. Believes he might have somehow visited his brother to check in on him, since his grandfather could no longer call him on the telephone. I've never heard of a group of kids visiting somebody who's dying, and this experience is a bit spooky to me, and I thought I would share it. It's just so weird to me because his brother experienced the same thing, and his brother is not dying. I'm so confused and upset by hearing my grandpa call out to him and seeing that he was with a group of kids. Yet my grandfather was not dead when this happened. I'm curious to find out if there's indeed reasons why maybe groups of children visit somebody dying. Not finding much information, but figured I would share this story here with all of you since it was spooky to me. Yellowstone Experiences. I've been in Yellowstone twice so far. The first time it happened was in 2016. Wife and I were staying in Grant Village. It looked like it was going to rain. The weather was awful and it was also getting cold. We zipped up the ventilation flaps and went to sleep. It was indeed raining heavily. And we got thunderstorms throughout most of the night, and we woke up around 8 a.m. and noted how beautiful that morning was. Then it hit us. All the flaps were down inside the tent. The main cover was still on. The tent was dry inside. No puddles or even droplets. There were only just the two of us, nobody else. We didn't hear anybody come in the tent, and she's a light sleeper and wakes up for unusual noises. It was frightening for her, but I was curious. Did anybody notice anything like that? Next day, it happened like a week ago to a family friend, like in July 29th. It was in Grant Village again. She was sleeping in a hammock. She woke up feeling that her feet was cold. She reached outside. Outside? She shouldn't be able to do that. This is when she realized her hammock was open. It is a double zipper one, and both were by her head. Head. Had too many drinks. She woke up that her entire hammock was unzipped. Okay. On Wednesday, July 31st, we were both about to head to Grand Tetons to catch the sunrise. My shoes were completely drenched, like they were put underneath water. The tent again was dry, no sign of water leaking in the tent, and every other cloth that was put right next to it to prepare for the morning rush was dry too. The last occurrence happened when we were about to leave the campground. We were at Canyon Village, and our time was like August 4th. It was up, but we decided to avoid a possible morning rush and leave early. We packed everything and we were about to head out. The wife wanted to drive her sister. They were on the passenger seat. I got the back seat. As I was sitting down, I felt something really cold touching me, like I was sitting in liquid. The left side of my pants were completely drenched. I jumped up thinking maybe one of the bottles burst or something. The seat was dry. The only bottle I found was the opposite end of the seat, an empty energy drink bottle. Wife's sister prefers it. Kept in the car so we could recycle it at the campground exit. The wet spot was oval-shaped, and it wasn't drenched where I was sitting on it, only around. Didn't have any distinct smell to it. Likely water, I thought. It was an interesting experience. Missing as a child. The following story happened to me when I was 4 years old, and I have no recollection of it. I only know what my family has told me. When I was a kid, my dad worked in Mexico and would visit us about once a month. We lived in a small town in South Texas. One day before picking him up at the bus station, my mom told my siblings and I to use the bathroom at home so I wouldn't have to use them at the bus station. My brother and sister said that they saw me walk into the bathroom, but they never saw me walk out. My mom opened the door to check in on me and I was gone. With the layout of our apartment, it would be impossible for me to walk out without anybody noticing. My mom started panicking and called my grandpa, who was a police officer at the time. Within an hour, multiple police officers and neighbors were searching for me in our apartment complex with no luck. 3 hours later, my grandmother found me in my bedroom sound asleep on the bed. Weird thing is that there were multiple people searching inside the apartment as well. They hadn't found me anywhere inside. It gets weirder. When they asked me where I was, 4-year-old me said I was in the sky, making clouds with a duck, using a machine that had a crank that you could spin on one side. Then clouds would come out of the other side. I also kept saying that I would see a red light on the TV screen for a few weeks. I didn't fully believe this story growing up until I was visiting my grandma in Mexico City years later. She confirmed it, saying my mom had called her crying right after it happened. My family likes to joke that I was abducted by aliens, then returned home after a few hours. This all happened 31 years ago. I still have no memories of it all. Christmas, 1980. I was 5 years old. My mom was going into labor with my younger brother. I stayed at my grandparents' house while my folks were at the hospital. I shared the queen bed with my grandfather, who was sound asleep snoring. At some point late in the night, I was awoken by the bed shaking quite vigorously. It continued for like 5 minutes, but who knows, maybe it was 30 seconds. I tried to shake my grandfather awake while calling for him to wake up. He eventually woke up groggily, but I had no clue why I asked him and what was happening. He quickly fell back asleep, but I was frightened and very awake. I was now sat up in bed, sitting in diffused moonlight. All was still and silent. I got up wanting to look at the Christmas tree. Christmas trees always brought me comfort, and that's what I craved after such a fright. From the foot of the bed you could look out into the room. The door was open. It was through the short hallway and into the front room in the picture window, maybe 25 or 30 feet away. They had a mid-century aluminum Christmas tree in front of that window. Not because retro is cool, but it was literally the same tree they used since the 50s. So as I looked out to that tree without lights at 3 a.m., it, along with some presents, sat quietly, only filtered by bluish streetlight gently filling the room with the weak illumination. However, something was different now. Sitting next to the aluminum tree was a pair of 2 huge black Doberman pinschers, sitting silent, still staring straight at me. They had no pets. I jumped back in bed and threw the covers over me. I eventually fell asleep and woke up to the morning sunshine making the aluminum tree warmly shimmer. I think about what happened that night from time to time. It's the first paranormal encounter I've ever had, and I've had a few. And at that point in my life, I don't think I even had a concept of ghosts or the paranormal. Was it simply a 5-year-old with a limited understanding of the world and an unlimited imagination? Was there something paranormal shaking that bed and presenting those enormous dogs? Levitation. In 2006, I shared a house with a couple of roommates in Tacoma, Washington. The house was haunted, poltergeist activity, etc. That's not the point of this story, though. However, it did sort of create psychological tensions, and as such, trying to go to bed and falling asleep was often uneasy. One night I'm laying in bed on my back when suddenly a tingling sensation spread across my body. I would describe the sensation like that of getting chills on your back and neck when somebody tells you an intense, frightening story. However, this was all over my entire body with more intensity. Needless to say, it freaked me out. Living in a haunted house, my assumption was that something paranormal was trying to haunt me. Although scared, I wanted to actively resist this. As I laid there with my body tingling, I spoke back very assertively. "I will defeat you." I slowly repeated it a couple of times. Then the sensation dissipated and ultimately left entirely. It was another uneasy instant in the house, but I eventually did fall asleep. About a year later, I was house-sitting at a nicer, more comfortable home. Laying in bed one of those nights, that sensation I felt the year before came back. It enveloped my whole body as I laid on my back, and again I was quite startled. What could this possibly be? Is it paranormal? Is it psychological or physiological? Either way, I didn't like it. And like before, I tried to resist it. However, that can happen against an invincible force, mind you. "I will defeat you." After about 20 seconds or so, the tingling dissipated and went away. Complete mystery as to what this was that I experienced twice up till now. Several years pass. Now it's 2011, and I, at least at that time, was living in Portland, Oregon for grad school. I loved this house I was living in. It was comfortable and felt like home. One night I went to bed totally normal. I wasn't overly tired, I wasn't intoxicated, and I was happy and I was healthy. I shut off the light, got into bed. I was comfortably on my back. I hadn't been laying there in the dark more than maybe a minute. That's when that tingling sensation came back. It started at my feet and legs, then spread up my body. It enveloped me toe to head in a matter of 10 seconds. Oh shit! I started to resist it. I felt the tingling dissipate. I realized I have some psychological control over this. Thought to myself, what's the worst that can happen? This house isn't haunted. It's not like you can kill me. Let's see what happens. I relaxed and surrendered to the sensation. It came back on in a wave from my feet and legs up to my torso and then up over my head. The more I feared or resisted, it would dissipate. The more I relaxed and surrendered, it would intensify. I got comfortable just allowing the tingling vibration thing happening to my body. It was like being submerged in a hot tub filled with pop rocks. There were hundreds of jets blasting me with pop rocks. Sounds cool. At this point, I had been comfortably buzzing on my back for maybe a minute. That's when I felt my supine body levitate, about a foot up, in fact. And I could feel the weight of the blankets as I pushed up on them. Furthermore, it's no longer dark in my room, and I'm levitating a foot above my mattress, and there's a soft, dim ambient orange glow in the room. I could see that my regular lights were off. There was no, seeming source of this orange light. This levitation freaked me out. Once again, I feared and resisted and felt my tingling body ease back to normal, back into bed. Well, I allowed myself to relax again. I rose back up again, and I'm quietly, excitedly freaking out. Holy shit, this is insane. But it felt good. The dim orange glow softly illuminates the room. I'm buzzing and floating supine above my bed. Now I start to helicopter counterclockwise, maybe about the speed of a second hand. When I'm about 180 degrees around, my feet are now at the headboard, I'm looking at the wall behind my headboard. The room is still dimly orangely lit. This blue wall was normally blank, but now hanging over my head is a painting. A painting I know. It's a painting my parents used to have hanging in their bedroom when I was a little kid. It's from home interiors, like mail-order home decor from the 70s, now hanging on the wall over my headboard. I completed a full 360, then my body eased back down. Then the tickling dissipated, and I laid there stunned. What the hell was that? I then realized, it was back to completely dark again in my room. I laid there completely perplexed, and I realized I felt comfortably drained. I decided I wasn't going to worry about it. Drifted off to sleep. Hasn't happened since. I should note, I didn't feel out of body, rather I felt in my body but levitating. It felt or seemed very real. There was no dreaming, at least never like this. I only wish I had a video camera catching it all. Would it show an orange glow and me floating, or would it have showed some kind of electrical interference? Would it be totally normal and nothing external? Everything was in my mind that was happening. Was it a spontaneous release of DMT? Help. Something on chair. I was living in a double-story house with my parents. I live in the lower portion of the house. I moved to this house a couple of weeks ago. When I first arrived here, I felt something wrong with this place. First night is as usual. I'm shifting my luggage and other stuff. Second night. This is like, there's this park in the front of my house. The park is not very big. I was sitting there smoking, and it was around 8 o'clock. I finished my cigarettes and went to a nearby shop for some snacks. Returned home on my way in front of the house. There was 4 chairs and a car parked in front of one chair. There was nobody around, not a single soul. I saw some grab the chair and moved it to the movement of the chair, so smooth as if somebody lifted the chair and placed it gentle. I don't know what thing got into me, and I just kept staring at it, and there's like some noise in my head saying, Go sit on the chair. Note, I live in Islamabad, capital of Pakistan, and the entire city is on the hills, and my house, well, I like the corner of the town, and behind my house is long hills with nothing but a creepy environment. Third night. On the third night, I'm just using my mobile, and the time is between 1 and 2 a.m. I'm just thinking about my previous incident, and in a blink of an eye, I saw a black figure in the corner of my room. I don't pay so much attention to it, and I started using my phone. My room is pitch dark. All lights were off. However, the figure I saw earlier was somehow clearly visible to me. I decided to go to sleep as soon as I was going to sleep, and I heard the sound of somebody crushing its teeth, and the sound so loud and clear. It's as if somebody's lying beside me. The sound stopped suddenly, and I felt like some inhale beside me. The whole night I felt the feeling of somebody laying with me. I was so creeped out and tell my parents, as you know, they won't believe me. My life in a Truman Show reality. There have been several instances I've felt like I'm living in the Truman Show, or at least a Truman Show situation, for lack of a better term. For some time there have been events in my life that just make me scratch my head and question things, like a lack of logical or solidified explanations present. And for context, I'm a man of science. I've got a bachelor's degree in comparative physiology, a master's in epidemiology. And currently I'm in medical school, and furthermore, I have almost a decade of research experience. I've worked in the science field for almost the same amount of time. I thrive on data, facts, and evidence, and I seek the sources for explanations, rather than jump to something greater. Though I have had many examples of these Truman Show moments, this one is the one that keeps me up most, and it's likely the longest. There was this one relative that I had. Let's call her Lynn for sake of privacy. I've never met them, yet was one of my closest relatives. Per my father, she was his cousin, but of his estranged uncle who lived on the opposite side of the country. His uncle, or my great-uncle, was a shifty man. He worked for the government of Virginia in the 30s throughout the 60s and early 70s, but no one really knew what he did. He somehow managed to avoid the World War II draft despite being selected, which many of our family members found strange, but didn't really question it further. So anyways, Lynn was his daughter. She married a lawyer from New York, but they never had any children and neither of them had any siblings, allegedly. She never worked because he was traditional, but she also didn't need to because as a lawyer, he did okay for himself. The more bizarre factor here is that nobody ever met Lynn, her husband, or either of their sets of parents. A lot of us think it was strange, but at the same time, it did make some sort of sense given her father was estranged from the family. The most that family had contact with her was through a very rare letter or phone call. Also, Lynn's husband passed away in the 80s, which has some importance. This will be brought up later. Fast forward to the 90s, when I was born. My parent brought me home after a couple of weeks in the NICU. There was a package from New York addressed to me, not my parents, and it was coming from New York. For my cousin Lynn, filled with clothes, toys, all sorts of things a new parent would have bought for their child. My parents tried to call to thank them, but couldn't get a hold of her, and was really unable to. At that point, my father and or mother had not heard from her in a couple of years. How did she know that they were pregnant or I was even born? There were no announcements in newspapers and nobody had contact with her for at least a couple of years. That was the first odd instance that my parents will acknowledge was absolutely bizarre and puzzled them to this day. Once I was born, she sent me letters and cards with money throughout my years. It was never a significantly substantial amount. I think the biggest one I ever got was $500 for my 18th birthday. That's not super relevant. I would also get calls from her on birthdays and holidays to wish me holiday greetings. Then I would send her flowers for her birthday, which was March 11th. But nobody actually knew how old she was. We just simply knew that her birthday was March 11th and that she was allegedly older than my father. But this really wasn't ever confirmed. This is also another important piece, I promise. Throughout the years, I continued to get calls, cards, and letters with money. We always asked and talked about the same things: the weather, what I was doing, and then about her cat Kaylee, who always signed her card next to her, indicated by a little cat paw print. Kind of cute. We actually asked for pictures of her because we wanted to hang out in her house, or hang them in our house. But no matter how many times we asked, we only got drawings, which looked like children's drawings. We were perplexed as to why she never sent a photo, especially when we specifically asked for them. The last time we asked for a photo, we got a drawing that depicted her as an angel. At this point, I was a senior in college. I had taken some psych courses and had been deep into my studies. So I asked that if there were any developmental issues or mental illnesses that she had or that my parents or family were aware of, which nobody said they thought so. She lived on her own independently, except she did have a cleaning lady come once or twice a week to do her bedding, which apparently she hated washing and doing. Not to mention the fact that she was starting to get up there in age, since my father was, and he was kind of the marker for her age. Our second-to-last phone call, I expressed to her that my father and I wanted to visit. After all, over 2 decades of sending money for birthdays and holidays, I felt the need to visit her and thank her in person. I wanted to learn more about her. She was unsure about it, but seemed to come around to it. I said next time we talk, we can work out a time that's good for all of us, just to give her some space since she seemed apprehensive to us meeting. The following month was my birthday, which she sent me a check, and of course I called to thank her as I always did. She seemed fine and seemed like her normal self. We talked about coming up to New York again to meet her. We agreed on a date 3 months away. I'll never forget the last words that she said. "We're always on your side," which I felt was a little strange because she used to say, "I'm always on your side," never "we." There was no "we." She lived by herself, her cat had passed away at that point, but she still had her housekeeper come by, but she still never referred to them as "we." A week and a half later, my dad called me saying that my cousin had passed away. This was in the summer of 2017. It felt awful. I had never met her, and she was so interested and invested in my life. I was upset about this, but nobody seemed to be fazed about her passing. I spoke to my family member, her cousins, my aunts and uncles. They said that they hadn't heard from her in decades. Now, they also had kids, my generation, but she never ever took any interest in any of them, even some cousins who were older than me. Some of them didn't even know who she was, which just puzzled me even further. We don't even know what she passed from. When I asked my dad about a funeral, he said that there wasn't any word on it. When I asked him how he heard about her passing, since nobody but me and my parents talked to her, he said it was at the hospital called and they informed him. There was no funeral, which further made me scratch my already very puzzled head. I figured maybe because she didn't have any close family, there wasn't going to be a funeral or memorial service. After a period of grievance, I didn't really think of her that much. It's tough to think about somebody you've never met, but nonetheless, I know what she looked like. I've only had phone calls with her. Over a year passes by and it's now December 2018. I get a letter from a law office in New York addressed to me. In a thick manila envelope was a copy of her will. As I was reading the will line by line, I was nodding to myself. $10,000 to her church, that makes sense. $5,000 to her housekeeper, yeah, that makes sense. Then I get to the last line. She left me her remaining possessions, including her house, its contents, and there's a second address that I'd never seen before. I was so flabbergasted and puzzled. Flabbergasted from the fact that she left me everything, not my parents nor my father, the closest blood relative to me. Further puzzled, I wasn't only inheriting one house, but a second that I'd never heard of before. She had never mentioned them in her calls, letters, or cards. She really didn't leave much, just go to the church, get her hair done, and then doctor's appointments. She usually had her housekeeper just help her with other things and groceries and household products. I found the business card from the firm that sent her will. I called the firm and asked to speak with the lawyer that signed the letter attached to her will. He was very professional and cordial on the phone and explained that it was the old firm owner that had drafted the will with her, and that he never actually met her. I glanced at the date, and the will was actually written in 2003, which would have meant I was 7 or so. At that point, I don't really recall talking to her. That really didn't start until I was 10. But she still sends cards, and I usually wrote a horrible, legible thank you card with a drawing or a photo of me. Anyways, he reaffirmed the will contents and testament was true. I asked if he was aware of a caseworker or social worker or anything that could give me more insight, which he replied he wasn't aware. I asked that he give the housekeeper my information and told her to call me, and he said he'd pass things along. After I got off the phone with the lawyer, I told my dad about the will and asked about the other property. He had used Google Street View to see a residential property, the one in the envelope that the address was from. It was a nice, quaint 1920s bungalow in the suburbs. There was one house across from hers, but there wasn't much else around her other than woods. We looked up the second property, and it was in the middle of nowhere, but the house was massive, and according to the tax records was estimated to be like $1.2 million, given it was a lakefront property with 23 acres. Damn. Not even 48 hours later, I was called by a representative from the state of New York. They were stating that they were going to liquidate the property to cover her medical bills. I didn't quite know how to react, so I just responded, "Okay, let me know if you need any more information," and hung up. Part of me thinks this is part of some gigantic ruse or Truman Show reality that I got too close to the truth, and so they burned the ties. This is about as much as I can remember from this part of my life, and still relatively fresh. But I still wonder who or what my cousin was. Was she legit, or was she part of something bigger? I fear that I'll never find out. Close this window. I tried to look into her husband, who very much so was a person and is well documented, but the interesting part is his obituary. There were no mentions of his wife or any other family. There wasn't even a survived by section. I feel like I'll never get answers, but I suppose time will tell. My own comment here. I don't see the Truman Show connection, not that I'm discounting your feelings about it, but I do know that medical bills do cost a lot. Could they cost $1.2 million? I don't know. But I'll tell you as somebody who's been written out of a will before, and I still don't understand why. Having somebody that you don't know think that way of you is an absolute blessing. Whether you've seen him or not, at least you shared drawings. Be thankful. Do not go to Rock Island, Wisconsin. Rock Island is a state park located at the tip of Door County, Wisconsin on Lake Michigan. It's a difficult place to get to. To get to the island, you have to take a car ferry from Allison Bay to Washington Island, drive across Washington Island to Jackson Harbor, then take a pedestrian-only ferry to Rock Island. No vehicles or bikes are allowed on Rock Island. Even though the island is relatively small, about 975 acres, it has had an interesting history. In the early 1600s, it was inhabited by a tribe of Potawatomi Native Americans, as well as a small fishing village of European settlers. The two groups did not trust each other, and did have a few bad encounters that almost led to violence, but for the most part they lived peacefully together on the island. By the 1640s, the Potawatomi had migrated to another part of Wisconsin. Shortly after the Potawatomi had left the island, some settlers from the fishing village reported seeing a new group of people on the island. They seemed to be more white settlers, but they wore strange clothes and kept to themselves. No one from the fishing village was ever able to talk to one of these new settlers, or even find where they were living. It was around this time that strange things started to happen in the village. Several animals, it's not worth mentioning what they were, but maybe it was pigs or chickens. They were found slaughtered in the village and seemed to have been used to make markings in blood on some of the buildings in the village. On a different night, a building used for preserving meat burned down. The villagers felt that these things must have been done by these new people on the island. They intended to find them. After a thorough search of the island, including the wooded inland area, they never found a single person. These strange occurrences seemed to stop soon after the search, and none of the other settlers were ever seen again. In 1836, the Potawatomi Lighthouse was built on the northern part of the island. After construction was finished, the lighthouse was inspected, and it was reported back that the material of which the lighthouse and dwelling are made are of the best quality, and that the work is done in a substantive and workmanlike manner. David E. Corbin was appointed the first keeper of the light on December 19, 1837. Only 3 years later in 1840, despite the apparent quality of the construction of the lighthouse, David Corbin started to complain that plaster started falling off the building. Some sort of liquid would ooze through cracks, leaving the house constantly damp. Corbin was completely alone most of the time at the lighthouse, and some have said that when visiting him, you could stare at certain walls and sometimes they would speak vaguely of other visitors. In 1845, after 8 years of relative solitude at the lighthouse, an inspector visited the lighthouse keeper and determined that while Corbin was fulfilling his duties, he was acting strange. The official report says that the inspector ordered Corbin to take a 25-day leave of absence to find a wife to live with him at the lighthouse. However, some think that the inspector was startled by Corbin's mental state caused by years of solitude and thought it would be the best for him to spend some time away from the island. In 1852, Corbin reportedly fell ill and died that December in the lighthouse. He was buried in a small cemetery just south of it. The next lighthouse keeper also reported the surprisingly quick deterioration of the lighthouse. Some friends that had visited the new keeper say that he would talk of seeing strange things in the house at night, but he wouldn't elaborate on what he had seen. In 1858, after only 22 years of service, the original lighthouse was torn down, a new one was built. From that point on, the lighthouse keepers were required to have an assistant keeper or family with them at the lighthouse. No strange occurrences were further reported in the lighthouse logbook outside of strong storms and occasional shipwrecks, except on January 20th, 1876. The keeper at the time, named Betts, reported that he saw 2 men attempting to row to a mainland from Washington Island. He wrote a terrible storm was coming up shortly after the departure. They never made it to their destination. Over 3 months later, on May 3, 1876, Betts wrote, "The 2 men who were lost last January have been seen several times, once from Caney Lighthouse at Jacksonport." Once from Jacksonport, if you didn't hear that. The men were apparently frozen stiff and sitting upright in the boat among a mass of ice. At last, that account they were still adrift. there's not much hope that they will be found and buried. By 1900, most of the island's inhabitants left for better fishing areas on Lake Michigan. In 1910, a successful business owner and inventor, Chester Thordarson, purchased all of the island, except for the land that the lighthouse occupied in the north. He used the island as a private summer retreat from his business in Chicago. Thordarson was responsible for unique and mystifying buildings and structures that are still on the island today. On the south end of the island, he built a giant stone hall that has a boathouse in the lower level. A stone water tower was built on the east side of the island, and an imposing wooden gate was constructed on the west end of the island. The Great Hall was used to store Thordarson's immense book collection. He had over 11,000 books, and it's rumored that he possessed some very rare books on the occult in his collection. Thordarson died of heart failure on January 6, 1945, though some have speculated that he saw something that actually scared him to death. I couldn't find any writings from Thordarson, however, that mentioned him experiencing anything strange on the island, but after his death, multiple churches and universities were interested in this book collection, but he had willed it to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, providing that they had to purchase it for $300,000, which they did. Some of this history is hard to find on the internet, but there are a couple of binders in the Great Hall that had a lot of his documented, personal papers. All of this history I gave is just to provide a little context for experiences I've had, directly or indirectly, on Rock Island. In August of 2021, I took my first and last trip to Rock Island. After taking 2 ferry rides, I arrived on the island at about 2 p.m. I'd booked the remote campsite E, which is a backpacking site that's a little over a mile from the dock. I took my time hiking out to the site to enjoy the scenery. Took a couple of breaks just due to how heavy my pack was. I was definitely packed more for camping than hiking. Got to my site, set up my tent, got everything situated. Started gathering sticks and driftwood from the beach so I could start a fire. On my 3rd trip back from the beach, before I got to my site, I heard a single high-pitched squealing noise come from the forest. It didn't sound close, but it was such an unusual sound that I stopped in my tracks and waited for a good 30 seconds. I was waiting to see if it would happen again. It didn't. So I continued back to my site. When I got back, I began working on getting a fire started. The remote camping sites on Rock Island are pretty well spaced out. Sites C, D, and E are grouped together. There's probably 100 yards between each site. There's not a real trail connecting the 3 sites directly, but enough people have walked along the ridge between the 3 sites, and there's an obvious path. As I was setting some sticks up in my fire ring, something caught my eye, and I looked up. Fairly far away, it looked like it might have been at Site D or a little further. Maybe it was a person running in my direction. My first thought was, well, that's odd, because like I said, it's not even really a trail they were on. Then my mind just went to there must be something wrong and this person needs help. Got a little closer and it looked like maybe it was a woman in loose gray clothing, maybe a hoodie. Still far enough away that I couldn't really make out any details. I quickly stood up from a crouching position I was in, and just as I did, I heard the high-pitched squealing noise again. It was behind me, and it was much closer this time. It startled me quite a bit, and I turned around to look behind me, and I scanned the trees for a couple of seconds. I didn't see or hear anything, so I turned back around because I knew the running person must be getting close. But now they were gone. Again, I stood there, scanned the trees, but didn't see them anywhere. I was so confused, I was kind of frozen for a few seconds. It was all very strange. But I was able to reason it out in my head that it was just a fellow camper from Site C or D. Maybe they were running to the pit toilet that was a couple of 100 yards west of the sites. I tried to forget about it, but it was really just bothering me. I didn't like whatever that squeal noise was, and it felt very strange. With some effort, I decided to let it go and started my fire. I had a quick meal and a couple of adult beverages, and then Adult beverage. What the heck was that? What in the world was that? I have to pause the audio to play back whatever the heck that was. Anyway, I was about to comment how I thought adult beverages was a funny way to put it, and then whatever that was happened. And I'm leaving it in. So, I had a quick meal and a couple of adult beverages, then decided to take a little walk. I hadn't seen Site C or D yet, so I thought I would check those out and see if maybe I had some neighbors camping nearby. Site D was empty. I did see the path that led from site to the main trail and the pit toilet that kind of made me feel a little less uneasy about the runner. I figured it was maybe somebody from Site C that took a strange way to get to the main trail by going through Site D. Didn't make a ton of sense, because I was probably, still shouldn't have been seeing them, or rather should be able to see them, but it made me feel better. I continued on to Site C and saw there was a tent set up. I really didn't want to bother anybody, but I just thought I would go over, with the excuse that I would introduce myself as a camping neighbor from Site E. See if anybody looked like they might have been the person running earlier. I came up on the site and there was a couple sitting at the picnic table. Neither of them looked like they would have been the person that I saw that was running. So I introduced myself. They introduced themselves. They were probably in their mid-30s. They were very nice and both seemed to be pretty drunk, but a quiet drunk. I didn't ask about the runner or the squealing noises because I thought it might be weird. I wished them a good night and walked back to my tent. When I got back, I had a cigar and a few more drinks. It got dark and it started as a perfectly good night. The sky was clear and I was just staring up and looking at millions of stars. I felt better about everything from earlier and felt stupid about the whole thing and decided to get some sleep. It was a long day, so I fell asleep almost immediately. At around 2:30, I woke up by a huge boom of thunder. It started downpouring. The wind picked up and the temperature dropped. I love camping in the rain, but I do not like camping in a lightning storm. A pretty big storm came through and I was starting to worry. The wind was whipping at my tent and the ground was shaking from the thunder and lightning. I did not feel good about being out there in a tent and felt very exposed. The storm lasted for about an hour before it became just a light, steady drizzle. I was just starting to fall back asleep when I heard the squealing noise again. I opened my eyes, and in the dark I just lay there silent. There was another loud squeal noise. It was pretty close. I knew there were no real dangerous animals on Rock Island. There's maybe deer and porcupines, but nothing like bear or wolves. Knowing that still didn't make me feel better, though. There was just something about that squeal that I didn't like. I say squeal because that's the best I can describe it. It sounded to me like a pig squeal. And honestly, I don't really know that much about pig noises, but that's what I thought of when I heard it. An injured or angry pig squeal. I continued to lay in my tent and started to hear footsteps outside of my tent. It was still raining, so the sounds were a little bit buried in the sound of rain, but it definitely sounded like a somewhat large animal or human walking around. I sat up in my tent and took a knife. Just wanted to feel better, and in my head I just kept saying, it's just an animal, it's fine, there's nothing in these woods that can hurt you. I listened as the footsteps started moving away from my tent. I just sat there being still, holding my knife for maybe 10 minutes without hearing anything else. I started thinking to myself, it's fine, it's just an animal, and you're being stupid and you need to get some sleep. I was just about to lie back down when there was a very loud squeal. It was right outside my tent. It felt like my heart just stopped, and a shiver went down my spine. My heart was beating so hard my entire body was pulsing. I felt it in my ears. Took everything in me, but I forced out a, "Get out of here!" It wasn't really shouting, but a stern and mean sound as I could make at that moment. I didn't hear any more squeals or footsteps that night. But I also didn't sleep. I just sat there in my tent for maybe an hour before I laid down. Eventually the rain stopped and I kept laying there until the sun came up, all that time reassuring myself that I was being stupid. It was just an animal. It was probably 7 a.m. before I decided I had to get out in the tent and relieve myself. As soon as I stepped outside my tent, I saw that my picnic table had been turned over and was upside down. When I saw this, I surprisingly calmly thought before the electrical interference turned my mic off. Okay, this is enough. I'm leaving the island today. I checked my surroundings. Nothing else seemed out of place. I eventually reasoned with myself that the wind had blown the table over during a storm. It still seemed a little strange. The table was pretty heavy, and I felt like I would have heard the table flipping over. That might have made sense. I made some instant coffee, had a bite to eat, started to feel better about the whole thing, then decided to go for a hike. I admit, I get easily scared when I'm camping by myself in the woods. Maybe that's natural. But after I had some coffee and food and the sun came out, I realized that nothing I heard or saw was really anything that could have been explained. Other than not getting a good night's sleep, I was having a pretty good time. The reason I came to the island in the first place was to hike the 7-mile Thordesson Loop Trail. I had a lot of interesting things to see. I was excited to start the hike. Packed a few things in my backpack and I started off. Fairly close to my site is the water tower. I have no idea how it was originally worked or why it had to be a tower, but it's an impressive building with a fireplace that looked like someone had recently had a fire in it. A little further down the trail is a cemetery where 2 sisters and a few others are buried. It's believed that there are still more buried here in unmarked graves. These likely are some of the settlers from the old fishing village. The island has 3 cemeteries. There's one by the beach, and there's one where Chester Thordesson is buried. There's one in the eastern part of the island where the 2 sisters are buried, and there's one in the northern part of the island where the original lighthouse owner-keeper David E. Corbin is buried. There's also at least one on Potawatomi burial site on the island, but nobody knows exactly where that is. I kept walking on the trail until I came to a nice scenic overlook area with a bench. That's where I sat down and drank some water. I started to hear some talking on the trail. This was ahead of me, but I couldn't see anybody yet. There was a bend in the trail and the trees were thick, so I sat on the bench waiting for these people to come around the bend. The voices were coming closer. I could tell that they weren't speaking English, but I couldn't place what language it might have been. Both voices were very, very deep and guttural. Then, back deep in the woods, I hear a loud and quick "Ooh." Immediately, both the voices I was listening to responded with their own, ooh. I kind of smiled because it sounded like these 2 heard whatever it was in the woods and were trying to be funny and mock it by responding. Got off the bench, put my backpack back on, and started walking the direction further down the trail where the voices were coming from. But I never did find these people. The rest of the hike went very well. I visited the cemetery where David E. Corbin is buried. I took a self-guided tour of the Potawatomi lighthouse. I passed the wood gate that apparently used to be part of a larger structure. I walked by the Great Hall and the dock area from where I arrived on the island. Visited some other structures on there too. Came across the cemetery where Chester Thordesson is buried and then finished the loop by returning to my campsite. It was a very nice hike with lots to see and wasn't especially difficult, but I was tired. I did walk down to campsite C to ask the couple I spoke with the night before how they did with the storm during the night, and apparently they packed up and left. I was disappointed because I also really wanted to ask them about the squealing noises during the night. The rest of the evening was pretty uneventful. I built a fire, made some meals, had a cigar and some drinks. As soon as it got dark, I was ready for bed, since I had so little sleep the night before. Got in my tent and quickly fell asleep. I might have been asleep for about 3 hours when I woke up suddenly and immediately fully was alert. Nothing that I was aware of caused me to wake up, but I felt something was wrong. Sat up in my tent, and this part's a little bit hard to explain. A feeling of complete dread washed over me. It was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. It felt like there was something in the tent with me. I could feel that it was angry, seething with anger, rage even. I could feel its hatred for me. It felt like something very bad was about to happen. Couldn't do anything about it. I started to shiver uncontrollably. There was a smell of garbage or rotten meat. It got stronger and stronger to the point where I wanted to throw up, but couldn't because I was frozen. I'd never felt so exposed and helpless. I stared forward at nothing, just frozen. The weird thing is I accepted whatever was about to happen to me. It was like my brain telling me that whatever's about to happen, even if it's death, it'll at least be relief. Then I passed out. At least I have to assume I passed out. That's all I remember until I woke up at 8 in the morning. When I woke up, I was laying outside of my sleeping bag on top of it. My legs were in an unnatural and uncomfortable position. I was on my back with my legs sort of straight out and my right leg was bent so my foot was up against my left knee. My heart started pounding, but I kept thinking to myself it was a dream. I'm leaving right now. It was a dream. Leaving right now. Packed up everything very quickly and started back toward the dock to catch my first boat off the island. Since the first boat from Washington Island doesn't arrive until about 10:30 a.m., I had to kill a little time around the Great Hall and dock area. Wanted to get off that island so bad. But I did feel a little bit better just being out of the woods and I could see other people. Sat down on a bench with a little bit to the east of the dock and lit a cigar, just to give me something to do while trying not to think about the night before. I was sitting a few minutes and scanning out over the water, and I was startled by somebody behind me saying, "Hi." I jumped and was embarrassed when the person came around saying, Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. Saw you smoking and just came over to ask if you had a lighter." I felt like an idiot. Told him that's just fine. I just didn't sleep well the last night and was kind of zoned out, and I handed him my lighter. He thanked me, lit a cigarette, then handed the lighter back to me. We started talking about the unusual things that you might talk about. He said he was from Madison. Talked about the storms that we've been having. He seemed to be a real outdoorsy kind of guy and talked about his plans to move to Washington Island. It was a nice, normal conversation and kind of took my mind off the night I just had a little bit. He seemed like a pretty nice guy. Then naturally asked me what site I'd been staying at. I told him I was staying at Site E the last 2 nights. He said he usually books that site, but I must have reserved it before him. He said he must have booked Site D the last 2 nights. I was surprised by this because no tent or anything was at Site D the 2 times I walked past the site. I told him this and he said that he comes to the island a few times a year and if you book a site, but he actually camps at different areas on the island. I asked him where he camps. He told me most of the time he camps in the East Cemetery, but he also likes to camp in the woods south of the lighthouse. He told me that he hikes about halfway down the Fernwood Trail and just heads north into the woods where he finds a place to camp. He said that one time he found the ruins of a small log house in those woods. He's going to try and find it again and camp inside of it. At this point, I started to change my opinion about this guy. Wanted to change the subject, but then he asked me if I had heard the screeches in the woods. I took a second to reply and knew he was talking about the squealing I had heard. Told him I had. I asked him if he knew what it was. This time he took a second to reply and I saw his face change. He looked as if he was thinking if he should tell me something, like a secret. With no expression at all in his face, he said, matter-of-factly, "A demon lives on this island." Unlike any other circumstance, I would have laughed this off, but not after what I experienced the night before. He looked at me and must have seen the anxiety and fear I was feeling. He surprised me by letting out a quick laugh. He asked me if I saw anything that night. I told him I hadn't seen anything, and he stared at me like he was trying to figure something out. I felt like he could tell I had experienced something. At this point, I was ready for the conversation to be over. Then he told me he had seen something in the cemetery that night. Now his face and mood kind of changed again, like he was trying to confide in me. I really didn't want to ask the questions, but I knew he wanted me to ask it. So I asked him what he saw in the cemetery. My voice was shaky. Then I could tell he had changed his mind about telling me. He actually looked at me with empathy and told me that what he saw was hard to explain. But if I was afraid of the screeching noises, he didn't think I should go near the cemetery. I didn't say anything right away, but he said 4 words without context. Keepers of the flame. I looked at my cigar and the ash was long. Put it out and told him I was going to wait by the dock for the boat. He nodded and I started to walk away. After a few steps, he said, "Hey." I turned around to look at him and he said, "Don't come back here." I turned around and started walking again. I don't know if that was a warning or a friendly suggestion, but I took it to heart. I was definitely not coming back to Rock Island. When I got home, I looked up Keepers of the Flame as it pertained to Rock Island. I found 3 things that he could have been referring to. The name of the Native Americans that lived on the island, the Potawatomi, could have been translated to Keepers of the Flame. The lighthouse keepers on the island were sometimes referred to as the Keepers of the Flame. Then there was also a 19th century cult that was said to visit the island from time to time that called themselves the Keepers of the Flame. I know that hundreds of people visit Rock Island every year and have a great time camping, hiking the trails, and exploring Chester Thardison's buildings. My humble suggestion is this: do not go to Rock Island. Anybody want to go to Rock Island with me? See ya.